we are back on the 0 hour. In case you hadn't noticed that it was our We Are Back music, it means we are back. And we are going to talk a little bit more about technology. We're trying to get Mark Ames on the line. Mark is a great writer on this topic. We have a lot to discuss with him. And, you know, you got him? Excellent. We love to hear that. Okay, Mark is a great friend of the show. I like to think he is he's a writer for PandoDaily. He was one of the founders before that of NSFW Corp. He's very well known as the founding editor of the satirical Moscow bi-weekly The Exile, which I was a big fan of. He's author of Going Postal, Rage, Murder, and Rebellion, From Reagan's Workplaces to Clinton's Columbine, and of course now well beyond. And he was a regular contributor to The Nation. He was a guest on MSNBC's Dylan Radigan show. And Mark, if you're anything like me, you haven't been asked on MSNBC in a long time, but maybe that's just me. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah, God, that list makes me feel pretty old at this point, but
oh man, don't even get me started. You don't know about being old, man. So listen, I mean, we're going to talk about a couple things. So it's great to have you, including, you know, I know you were interested in talking about my now infamous Nationalize Google piece, which, by the way, I didn't write that, but I'm warming up to the idea. But I want to talk about a couple things you wrote, starting with, and this was such a big deal to me. The Google, your headline was Google wants us to forget about its near total monopoly over what we know, and this has to do with the EU saying that people ought to have a right to object to information that's on a Google. In fact, I think I used this case in my piece, but tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
Well, so and the EU has a somewhat stronger, it seems to be, privacy laws and antitrust. And granted, the bar is incredibly low if you're comparing it to America, but particularly on antitrust. But they do seem to be stronger on that. And there was a ruling from the EU, I don't know, about a month or so ago, that people who want to be, forgotten, essentially, so that some link to an article about them, perhaps it's defamatory or something like that, that they could have it removed, because essentially, well, see, people didn't pull back the camera enough on this, because if there's a link and it says something about you and it's high up on, it's certainly on the first page or two, which would be like, front page in a newspaper or front shelf in a store, that's what people are going to know about you. And Google makes money off that, and individuals want to have the right to privacy, to not have, to be able to say what people might know or not know about them. And of course, the other side of the argument is, well, what about the right to information and freedom of press and, and so on. So that's sort of how the debate has been confined to, thus far, which is privacy versus freedom of speech. And my point was, I mean, that's true, but my point is, there's never been any monopoly on information and on what we know that comes anywhere close to Google. And that's really what we should be talking about. I mean, when we want to know something, we Google it, and whatever appears on the first page is true, and it's what we know. I mean, true in the sense of this is what we believe to be true, and believe what we know and what we should know. It's as if, I mean, the BBC, CNN, New York Times, Itar Tass comes to Moscow Pravda. There's never been anything like this with this much power that crosses borders and minds and platforms. Like
right.
Google.
So if the right outlet writes that, Richard Eskow mates with goats, and it gets picked up and it's the top search item, and it happens to not be true because I don't roll that way, literally, most human beings on Earth are in the situation where if they happen to Google my name anywhere on the planet, that's what they're going to see. So it's not like the old days when a newspaper might run its story in a town that says local writer mates with goats, and then I can complain, I can file a suit, I can.
Yeah.
There's nothing. Your point is a great one. There's nothing like it.
Yeah, and I think that's, sometimes I think Barry Lynn made this point, his name in that book Corner, that book about monopolies, that, at a certain point, the tight focus of the debate about the power of Google and the power of the internet, focusing overly tightly on privacy issues, really masks the politics of internet monopolies. And the power that internet monopolies have over us, which is just absolutely unlike anything we've ever seen. And so I feel like at some point, we got to pull the camera back and talk about the power that they have over us and over what we know and over our minds and over knowledge.
And let me give you another example, because it strikes me. Okay, Google owns YouTube. This program is right. It depends to a certain extent, lesser extent, but it depends on its Google channel, its YouTube channel, to keep viewers, if they want a visual feed along with it, to watch. There are times when I've wanted to use, I play music, I write about music, comment about music downloading, also music as culture. If I want to play a Lana Del Rey song, Ultraviolence, or something to talk about what it says culturally, I run the risk of running afoul, not of copyright law, because it's fair use, but of Google rules and regulations. And Google can arbitrarily lower the ranking of my channel or block it altogether. And I have no legal recourse. Google is acting with 80-90% of video views coming through YouTube. Google has the right to destroy my YouTube channel as a business enterprise, and I would have no recourse, even if I didn't do anything wrong, even if it was fair use, even if Lana Del Rey agreed before the fact to let me do it. If Google's algorithms decide I violated the rules, they can shut my business down.
Well, they can also, that power is just incredible, but they could also do that for business reasons, right? I mean, they could just decide that maybe they're funding some startup, radio startup or YouTube startup that for some reason you're taking viewers from or business from, and that it makes just bottom line sense for them to push you down or block some of your shows or whatever and promote something that is more in their business interests. And that's frightening. I mean, this is why I kind of keep going back to the railroads and the octopus. I mean, what did the railroads do? They had the power to discriminate like that. All of a sudden, the railroads appeared, and so you didn't bring your farm goods, your grain, or whatever to market on horse and buggy anymore. You brought it by train, but then the railroads could decide who they were going to favor and who they weren't, and they could invest in their own farms and destroy other farms by making their time to market much slower or much more expensive.
I just realized, Mark, that when you use the term Techtopus, which you like to do to talk about the Silicon Valley Techtopus, you're referencing the old, was it Frank Norris book, The
Frank
Octopus?
Norris. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Frank Norris.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And the old populists.
Yeah, so you're right on. I mean, this is 19th century stuff with newer technology. And you also have written a lot about the wage fixing that they've been doing, where, they believe in the free market until it works against them, and then they suppress it by deciding they're not going to compete for employees. They're going to illegally suppress the right of employees to judge among competing offers. And there's been, some coverage on PandoDaily of that. But now you mentioned that the people who bring us the lovable animated figures of Wall-E and the clownfish and all that are part of this, right?
Yeah, well, they actually started it, which is the incredible thing. I mean, it began in 1986, this secret and illegal agreement that violated antitrust law. The agreement was initiated between George Lucas of Lucasfilm and Pixar's heads, Ed Catmull, and Steve Jobs, who financed the spinoff of Pixar from Lucasfilm in 1986. And then Jobs became essentially the owner and CEO of Pixar after that. And they agreed to make it look. I think, first of all, another part of the story is Lucas brought his studios up north and in Northern California, I have heard a lot, and I assume as well, in part to avoid labor unions, because as we know in Hollywood, I mean, this is one of the few areas where artists and people in the arts and creative, arts, whatever you call it, are very strongly unionized or guildized, and those guilds and unions work and protect the workers there. And up in Northern California, there wasn't that. And what was Silicon Valley at that time? It was defense industry. I mean, so a lot of that same culture kind of carried over. It was kind of the technology side of the defense industry, and then eventually became Silicon Valley. And so anyway, in '86, they agreed not to poach or bid up each other's employees, or if an employee left, they would inform each other. If one employee was leaving for another and came to them to seek a job, they would inform each other at the top level.
You see, that part is really horrible. So what happened? Yeah. Did Lucas just send out notes to his friends saying, don't call my employees because these are not the droids you're looking for? Or
yeah, it's kind of like that. It's more like an evil Yoda. The language that he uses is very sort of, responsible it would not be, or I mean, it's more like he talks all this sort of ethics and responsibility and what's right, and what he's doing is essentially stealing his workers, not even just their wages, but we're talking about a really creative industry where people want to move around for opportunities for. I mean, it's tough to be a writer or an artist or anything, and one of the few payoffs is the creative, joy of being involved in a great project, and
that's a fantastic. Yeah, it's a fantastic point. Also, there might be somebody who's like an AD, an assistant director on animated projects for one studio, and there might be an opportunity for him or her to realize their creative vision as a writer director somewhere else. But no, because they've colluded to prevent that.
Yep, exactly. And so what I found, again, going back to the documents, because the wage theft lawsuit that's been going on, it's still a little bit in limbo. They had agreed to a settlement in both sides did in the end of April for $334 million, and this involved this is for Google, Apple, Intel, and Adobe, I believe it was. Lucasfilm and Pixar had already settled. But going back to the suit, because the judge decided she wasn't sure that the $334 million settlement figure was fair to the victims, I went back again and decided to go back to the origins of this case, which is in computer animation and the workers in that. And, it just gets really ugly all over again. I mean, there you see, I wrote about DreamWorks animation all over it. So this is DreamWorks Animation is run by Jeffrey Katzenberg, who is Obama's biggest bundler for the past two campaigns. And he is repeatedly in different emails and a testimony, their name comes up as being a participant in this illegal scheme. Yet, as far as I know, they weren't investigated by the DOJ, and they certainly weren't charged by the DOJ.
Well, I want to talk more about this and what we do about whether we nationalize these bastards or what. But when we come back after the break with Mark Ames, we'll talk more about the monopolistic, cynical collusion that goes to infinity and beyond. Mark, stick with us, please. We'll be right back. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we're back on The Zero Hour with Mark Ames, writer for PandoDaily, gadfly and critic of the monolithic, monopolistic Silicon Valley corporations, and good friend of the show. Mark, we've unfortunately only got about 5 minutes left, but in the time because I feel like we could go on this for hours, but
I know.
In the time we've got left, and it's so important to be talking about this stuff, I think people don't realize how massive and powerful these monopolies have become. So I wrote this piece, which was given the headline "Nationalize Google and and Amazon and Facebook all. I was really talking more about regulating them as public utilities, which I think is a very reasonable, balanced argument, particularly given the way they abuse their power. But what do you think? What's the solution to all of this?
I think either one of those is certainly a solution, or breaking them up, or whatever. But, ultimately, I think they want us to believe that by leaving them alone, we become freer. And I think what people are learning slowly, despite, the volume of propaganda that's been pumped out of Silicon Valley and Washington about free markets for, the last couple of decades, that we're learning that we're becoming less free. And the only way to regain some of our political power over our lives and over, our politics in this country is by reducing their power. And that means regulating them or nationalizing them, or regulating or nationalizing maybe some aspect of it and regulating other aspects of it. I can't tell you what we should do, but we need to seriously start talking about it. And I can tell you that the big tech companies, despite all the noise that they make about, net neutrality, which Google's already backing away from, they don't seem to care about net neutrality anymore, or all the noise that they're making about privacy or the NSA, that the one thing they fear the most, and the one thing that they're gearing up for more than anything is fighting antitrust laws. And their biggest fear is that antitrust taking them apart. And they know it better than we do. They know the history of this country better than we do, it seems. But this country has a long history of not tolerating mega corporations or mega power over our lives and over our politics. And I think it's inevitable that this is going to be talked about in a serious way more and more. So your piece kind of helps bring it out into a wider audience. I thought it was great.
Oh, thanks, man. I mean, I think the important thing is to break the kind of mythology that somehow they've managed to become massive billion-dollar corporations while they've been very smart while propagating the mythology that they're disruptors. They're not disruptors. They're the ones who should be disrupted. They're the power elite. And yet they're still in this sort of, it's us against the system mode.
Yeah.
And you also get this invisible, there was a paper I want to respond to, a piece I want to respond to called The Invisible Economy, that says, well, we don't realize how much we get for free now, that you can, people use Google News. They don't have to spend $280 for an annual newspaper subscription, but people are contributing the labor that creates Facebook and some of this other stuff. We're paying in ways we don't always see, including our privacy, including our time, including our attention. So that's why I think it's so important for guys like you to keep pushing at these guys and digging at these guys. So in the minute or two we have left, what are you working on right now? Can you say?
I still plan to do at least one or two more pieces on the Silicon Valley wage step piece in the near future. And for next week, I have a pretty bombshell piece, I think, about some of the Koch brothers. I've been writing about them since early 2009 because they reminded Yasha Levine and me of the Russian oligarchs so much when we first came across them. And I have a piece coming out that really demonstrates their political extremism in a pretty shocking way. That's all I'll say about it right now.
Well, I hope you'll come back and talk to us about it when it comes out, because they are the other monopolistic overlords of the dystopic American future that we're trying to undo. So Mark Ames, writer for PandoDaily, advocate for all that is good and pure in the technological hell we live in. Thanks so much for joining us on the Zero Hour.
Thanks for having me on again.
You bet. And that's it for this week's episode. Bill Gates mangling the education world with his money, the Techtopus mangling all sorts of aspects of our lives and more to come. We'll have a lot to cover. Tar sands, fracking, everything else. Thanks for joining us. As always, I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.